Racism plays a significant role in the exploitation of our motherland Africa's natural resources by multinational corporations and foreign governments, a dynamic that has deep historical roots and ongoing consequences for African communities. The situation can be understood through several intertwined aspects, and I am going to untwine them with facts. During the colonial era, European powers used their highest level of violence to divide Africa and extract its resources, with little or no benefit to the indigenous African population. The extraction was justified by racist ideologies that portrayed Africans as inferior and their lands as open for exploitation. These practices laid the groundwork for the economic inequalities that persist to this day. Even after some African nations gained independence, the structures of exploitation remained in place, often with the active participation of foreign corporations and governments. The legacy of colonialism continues to shape how Africa's resources are controlled. Instead of benefiting from their own resources, many African nations remain trapped in what is now known as neo-colonialism, where foreign powers and corporations maintain economic dominance over the continent. So these corporations and governments use the capital that they built by stealing the resources from Africa to continue exploiting the African people. The racial hierarchy established during colonialism still impacts labor practices in many African countries. Many multinational corporations exploit cheap labor, often under unsafe working conditions, while offering minimal wages or benefits to local workers. Workers, especially those in mining, face systemic discrimination, and their rights are often ignored. In the extractive industries, such as mining for minerals like gold, cobalt, and rare earth metals, corporations and foreign governments have often prioritized profits over the well-being of local populations. The benefits from these resources are not reinvested in local economies, and the wealth generated by mining largely flows out of the country into foreign corporations and governments. This exacerbates poverty and economic inequality in Africa. Many African countries are rich in natural resources, like I've said, but these riches have not translated into widespread prosperity. This is partly due to the extraction practices that favor multinational corporations and foreign governments rather than the local population. This phenomenon, often referred to as the resource curse, leads to economic dependence on foreign countries rather than creating sustainable development. Many African governments are heavily in debt to foreign countries and international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These institutions often pressure African governments to open their natural resources to foreign exploitation in exchange for loans or debt relief, leaving the local population with little control over their own land and resources. But how were they able to do this? Because long ago, they came over and stole from the African people and used that capital to keep them down. And then when they needed resources to survive, like clean water and food and all of the things, they controlled trade. So it forced them into debt. You see? So they stole from the African people, leaving them without the resources they needed. And then said, okay, I'll help you out, but now you're in debt to me. And now to pay back the debt, I'm going to come in and mine for gold and diamonds and stuff so you can repay me back. As if it was some kind of equal trade. It's sick. They are sick. But let's talk about the environment. The mining operations in Africa often lead to significant environmental damage, deforestation, soil erosion, and water contamination, which disproportionately affects local African communities. These communities have little power to challenge the environmental destruction that threatens their land, health, and livelihoods. The environmental damage from mining activities also impacts public health. Toxic materials used in mining, such as mercury and cyanide, are often contaminating local water supplies, leading to severe health problems because the local population is expendable to the corporations, leading to long-term health crises among African communities where there is no accountability from these corporations. This is why unity is so important. In many cases, practices. Corrupt African elites and political leaders collude with foreign corporations and extract resources from their countries without considering the welfare of their people. They betray their people. This often leads to the uneven distribution of profits where local populations receive little or no benefit. The political elite, in exchange for kickbacks or bribes, may also even ignore environmental and human rights abuses perpetrated by these corporations. Lack of accountability. Many African governments are unable or unwilling to regulate the activities of foreign corporations. This lack of accountability allows corporations to continue exploiting the land and the people without facing consequences for their actions. The influence of foreign powers, especially former colonial powers, further entrenches these systems. The global economic system is often structured in ways that benefit rich, mostly Western nations, at the expense of poorer, often African nations. The extraction of resources from Africa feeds into global supply chains that benefit the economies of developed nations while leaving African countries to deal with the environmental, social, and economic fallout. This radicalized system perpetuates inequality and hinders the development of African nations. African nations are often at a disadvantage when negotiating trade deals with powerful multinational corporations and foreign governments. The terms of these deals are often heavily skewed in favor of foreign interests, resulting in African countries receiving only a small fraction of the profits generated from their own resources. Despite the systemic exploitation, there are numerous examples of African communities and activists fighting for justice, better working conditions, and equitable sharing of resources. Organizations like the African Union, as well as grassroots movements, are pushing for stronger environmental protections, fair trade agreements, and more control over natural resources. There have also been calls for reparations and accountability from foreign colonial powers and multinational corporations for the exploitation of the continent's resources. These demands reflect a broader desire for economic justice and an end to the racial and economic disparities that continue to shape Africa's place in the global economy. The radicalized exploitation of Africa's resources is a complex and deeply entrenched issue, rooted in colonial history of the continent and sustained through the global economic structures that continue to marginalize African people. It's not just about economic extraction. It's about a system of radicalized power that allows foreign powers and corporations to profit from Africa's resources while leaving local communities impoverished and disenfranchised. True justice and equity for Africa will require dismantling these systems of exploitation and ensuring that the continent's vast resources are used to benefit its people rather than being siphoned off to enrich others. Mining in Africa is a global endeavor, with many countries and corporations involved in the thievery. Give Africa back to its people. Stop thieving. Stop stealing. Get out of Africa. Give Africa back to its people. That's all you can do. And for my brothers and sisters in Africa, global Black unity is coming. We will not stand alone in this fight. We will stand together. We will give Africa back to its people, and we will bring power to Black people everywhere. I love you, Black man. I love you, Black woman. Knowledge is power. Power to the people.